Hey everyone, welcome back to Interpersonal Communication. Today we're going to look at the last chapter of the bi term. We're going to look at just a few small portions of chapter 12, which is about communication in families. And as we go and as we talk about it, it's important to remember that every relationship is different, but also every family is different. And so there's plenty of diversity along the way as we talk about some basic concepts that may be useful as we discuss families. Clifford Notorious in 1996 published a study that identified three key elements that you can see here with this pyramid that influence how satisfied people are in long-term relationships, especially how they are in family relationships. Talking about words, thoughts, and emotions. We'll start by unpacking this idea of words and how it influences how satisfied we feel in family communication. Words, obviously, as you might guess, refers to how people talk to each other and behave toward one another. How people speak to you influences your self-esteem and your feelings about the relationship as a whole. Not surprisingly, in happier relationships, people tend to verbally communicate more support, more agreement, more understanding, and more genuine interest than in less happy relationships. In contrast, people that have more difficult or what you might simply call unhappy families tend to, when they do speak to one another, be very negative, focus on criticism, focus on disagreement, and focus on misunderstandings that you may have. And the differences in the communication of happy and unhappy families echo the material on climate and conflict that we've already discussed earlier this semester. The second element in family communication is thoughts, which is how family members think about each other and family. Our thoughts shape our emotions and our words. And a lot of this has to do with the kind of internal self-talk you have about the relationships in your family. These kind of internal qualities within each individual. For example, if you go home for the weekend, your mom could think, oh, he just came home this weekend because he wants me to help with laundry and he wants a few free meals. And that's not necessarily a negative thought. But if the mom instead thinks, my son came home for the weekend because he cares about me and he missed me, the fact that you came home for the weekend didn't change. But how, in this hypothetical example, your mom chose to think about that scenario really influenced how she thought about your relationship together. In the same way, um, if, let's say, your younger sister um, forgot to call you on your birthday, you could say and think, as we talk about the thoughts kind of segment here, you could think, well, my sister didn't call me on my birthday because she doesn't care about me. And that would certainly shape um, that relationship in a negative way. Or you could think, my sister didn't call me on her birthday because she's really got a lot going on right now. I'm sure she'll talk to me soon. So how you think about those relationships can really influence how satisfactory they are. And then ultimately, um, the third key to family communication is emotions. And our emotions are especially affected by both the words that we hear, if someone is mean, if someone is negative, if someone is positive, if someone is a good listener. Um, those things can affect our emotions as well as how we choose to kind of frame um, or think about someone in our own time with our self-talk. So words, thoughts, and emotions, they all go together as a part of family communication. Sorry. One thing that's also worth thinking about is the communication pattern that your family has. You know, some families are really conversational, really open in their communication, where they're free to free to openly express themselves. Their thoughts and feelings include ones that are personal or non-typical or private. Some families aren't very conversational, and you may not share a lot about how you're feeling or how you're really doing, and may focus more on superficial topics like what you're watching on television or the weather or maybe a sporting event or the news. Not really dealing with a lot internal or personal stuff. In the same way, some families are very high conformity families, where in some situations you will benefit by kind of going with the flow. This is what your textbook calls conformity orientation, which refers to the extent in which family members are expected to adhere or conform in their beliefs. So, maybe growing up, you were free to disagree with your mom or dad or grandparents or whoever all day, every day. And maybe you weren't, where there's very little conflict and lines of authority are very clear and to be respected. So maybe you were allowed to talk a lot and you could disagree with everyone. Maybe you were allowed to talk a lot, but you couldn't disagree with your parents when it really came down to it. These are all kind of four main patterns. As we can talk about the consensual pattern, high conversation, high conformity orientation. And this was um, very much the pattern that I was raised in, where I could talk about anything, and so could anyone else in my family. Our deepest, innermost thoughts, our opinions about a wide variety of topics, both personal and impersonal. But ultimately, um, I was expected to adhere to my parents' values and beliefs, even when I may have secretly disagreed with them. Another common pattern is the pluralistic family, which are high on the dimension of conversation and low on conformity. This is where not just communication is open, but disagreement is encouraged as well. Parents expect their children's views and decisions to be not only shared, but if they don't disagree with them, that it's ultimately encouraged. Then we have the protective pattern of family communication. In this example, um, the family may avoid conflict at all cost, and children are expected to adhere to their parents' values, beliefs, and decisions. And so there may not be a lot of open communication along the way. And then finally, this kind of laissez-faire family in which parents and children may have limited interaction, and children are inclined to be relatively independent. And because there's not a lot of conversation or a lot of expected conformity, it is difficult in this scenario, this fourth scenario, for family members to feel close bonds in a lot of examples because both conversation and conformity is low. And as you can imagine, if we look at these four different patterns, think about which one your family was growing up. But in all of these scenarios, maybe more difficult on the fourth category here, Family members can still be close, but dealing with difficult topics might be more challenging in some of these groups than others. Your book also spends a lot of time talking about the family life cycle. I do want to at least briefly mention this to you. This follows a common pattern first published by Olson and McCubbin in 1983 that describes um, the common 7 stages that a lot of families go through. Now, if you and your partner do not have children, you will notice you will skip most of these stages. But statistically speaking, most of you, just odds are, will have children. And so I do want to talk about this for just a brief minute or two. The first phase, establishing a family, in which is when a couple settles into a committed relationship um, and kind of decides the daily routines for their shared life. For couples that get married, this is stage 1. Stage 2 happens with the addition of children. This is a major change in families' lives. I don't think any of you are surprised by that. I don't think any of you are frantically writing that down as a mind-blowing note to this lecture. But transition to parenthood brings a wide variety of joys and problems and challenges and introduces a lot of new roles. Um, and so people become mothers, people become fathers, and it's a whole different aspect of life that you haven't thought about before when you enter stage 2. Furthermore, when you have children, that's going to decrease the amount of time that the couple will spend together and change the focus of the overall communication. Because for most parents, children become a primary focus of the communication. And this, perhaps more than any of these other stages, requires a significant time of adjustment and expectations of not just joy, but disappointments as well. There's a lot of change and stress to handle in this short stage of time and plan, excuse me, um, in stage 2. There's a lot of stress and change in this short span of time for stage 2. As we go on, stage 3 becomes children with elementary or high school. This is the stage that I'm in personally. As we get to stage 4 and stage 5, there's a lot of overlap between stage 4 and stage 5. Your parents are dealing with stage 4 and 5 right now because you're in college. So you are not only developing your own social circles and interests, but as students that are over the age of 17, 18 or above, you have left the nest and your parents have launched you into the quote unquote real world here in stage 5. This probably as much as a change from stage 1 to stage 2 is a major stage for most parents because children are going to leave home. They're going to go to college or to the military, or they're going to simply move out or marry and live a life on their own. And this can be very abrupt. Um, a lot of parents experience the so-called empty nest syndrome in stage 5, um, where they have to figure out what does life look like without children. And so they do that by entering stage 6, which is post-launching of children, where all the children have left the home and the couple is once again, as a duo, the primary unit of the household. And this can be, depending on their relationship, very much a blessing or a curse. For some couples, this is almost like a second honeymoon, a time of renewed focus and love because you're able to focus on your partner and not have to plan your daily life around your children or your children's schedules. At the same time, this can be a a difficult time for a lot of couples because children are often the glue that will hold a couple together. And so sometimes you'll see couples divorce after the last child has left the home. Teaching this class in particular, sometimes I have college students that are really thrown that their parents who have been together their whole lifetime are suddenly seeking divorce when the child is 19 or 20. And it really depends on what they chose to focus on after the children have left the home. And sometimes that can be a very difficult transition. But it can also be a very positive one for couples as well, and I want to state that too. Finally, the last stage of the family life cycle is retirement. This is when couples go to work full time and then suddenly they don't go to work anymore. And this, much like stage 6, can be very positive or negative, but for many people, retirement is a time to do what you always wanted to do instead of focus on building wealth, paying off debts, and trying to earn a living. But I don't think it's surprising at the same time for a lot of individuals, their self-worth is not tied to their family relationship, not tied to their faith. Sometimes your self-worth can be tied to your work. And so this can be difficult for people who suddenly don't have a job to go to on a daily basis to find meaning in their life. Thankfully, during these retirement years are often when the addition of grandchildren can come along, and this new addition of family members can kind of add some new focus and responsibility in this retirement age. And that, in a very quick fashion, is the family life cycle. Finally, I wanted to close by talking about just a few of the guidelines your textbook mentions for effective communication in families. The first one of these is to maintain equity in family relationships. Your book defines equity as fairness based on the perception that both people invest equally in a relationship and benefit similarly from these investments. So your book kind of contrasts this idea between social exchange theory and equity theory. Social exchange theory thinks about every relationship you have, family or otherwise, as almost like an accounting or economics analogy, where every relationship you're in costs you something, time, effort, money, emotions, but it also comes with benefits, support, affection, meaning, and so on. And so social exchange theory would suggest that you apply these economic principles to your relationships. So if the cost exceed the rewards, that you'll be dissatisfied and move on. There's certainly people that live their life that way and buy into social exchange theory. But what I think is typically going to be more useful to you, and the author of your textbook agrees with me on this, is adopting this idea of equity theory. Um, Instead, we tend to look at relationships that are satisfying and enduring because we look at that relationship again, if that's with your parents, if that's with a sibling, um, but also outside of family relationships, with your closest friends, with significant others, and so forth. The relationships that are satisfying are typically satisfying because people like relationships with people who contribute about as much as they do in ways that matter to them. And so the idea is, especially in your family relationships, we would like those to be equitable over time. So if you are putting forth energy and emotions and effort and spending time and communicating feelings and doing activities together, if the other person is putting forth that same kind of investment, not in the average day or even in the average year, but over the span of your relationship together, we tend to seek for that equity, for that fairness there. As long as it's perceived as relatively equitable over time, we're likely to be satisfied. We all have friends and family members that may be overwhelmed or distant for a short time because of some commitments or personal issues, but typically equity is um, a major key to happiness in relationships. That if you're always the one that's reaching out, always the one that's asking to do things, always the one that's kind of carrying the load of the relationship, either physically, mentally, socially, that can be a difficult thing. But it's that back and forth that makes relationships meaningful, especially in family relationships over time. Some other quick tips to think about. The first one of these is to make daily choices that enhance intimacy. Every day you've got a choice of how you're going to spend your time, who you're going to talk to, if we're going to be constructive or destructive, if we're going to extend grace and trust, or if we're going to extend negativity and judgment. And so typically we focus on these big, grandiose moments of life to build important relationships. But often it's these small, not at all dramatic, everyday small choices that will create or destroy families. If it's listening to a child when you're really too tired to listen, if it's buying a card or flowers for your significant other when there's really no special occasion, just doing it to do it, finding the energy to play a game with someone when you've had a rough day, or choosing to engage in dual perspective to really understand your parents, even though you may completely disagree with them. You stay in touch with um, people's concerns, hopes, and dreams. Those kind of daily choices are going to really be effective. It's the smallest choices that we make that you may even be unaware of that are going to enhance the quality of our families and the quality of the relationships that you have. The fourth, I think it's the fourth, we'll say it's the fourth tip, is to show respect and consideration. In order for families to remain healthy and satisfying, you need to demonstrate that you value and respect one another. As obvious as this may be, a lot of families don't follow it. Because there's an expectation both in family relationships and committed romantic relationships that you're going to be forever to get that you're going to be together forever, that comes with family relationships, that comes with committed romantic relationships, is that you're committed for the long haul. A lot of times we take the people um, in our lives for granted. Sometimes we can treat strangers with more respect and kindness than we do maybe our children or our parents or our siblings or our romantic partners, because it's easy to take them for granted. They're going to be with us anyway. They're going to be in our house anyway. And to be less loving and respectful and considerate than we should be. So choosing respect, choosing consideration can go a long way, and being mindful of those choices. And finally, don't sweat the small stuff. As I continue to get tongue-tied as I record this morning. The last tip: don't sweat the small stuff. As you think about your life, when you're an old woman or an old man, and you look back on the 70, 80, 90 years that you have lived, how will you have want to handle the relationships that matter most to you? Your romantic relationships, your work relationships, and yes, as we talk about chapter 12, your family relationships. Think about the future. We all have things that irritate each other: quirks, habits, mannerisms. And at the same time, we love our family members. Most of us would never consider giving up our families, and we want them in our lives on a regular basis. And so we need to try to reduce our tendency to make mountains out of molehills and focus on things that matter most. Save your energy for working on the big stuff. One of the big takeaways from this class is that conflict is inevitable. It's a part of life. It's a part of relationships that we're in. But focusing on those conflicts, making them bigger than they need to be, that's not inevitable. That's a choice. And so as we focus on relationships, don't sweat the small stuff. Extend grace to one another. Show respect. Show consideration. And treat the people that are in your life that you care about most the way that you want to be treated. And you're bound to have an effective relationship together. That being said, I want to thank you again for listening. I'll talk to you again soon.